My name's Eliza Canty-Jones, and I work at the Oregon Historical Society. And we're so pleased to be able to have tonight's program, this tasting flight of new books by four incredible authors who we're so pleased to have with us this evening. We want to begin our program tonight, as we always do, by taking a moment to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. Wherever you are in Oregon or in the United States, you're on Indigenous land. And I'll say I'm coming to you from my home in Southeast Portland, where we do everything now that we're all at home. And here in Portland, we're located on the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. We always want to take a moment to center ourselves in the thinking about the long history of Indigenous relationship with place here in Oregon, and as I said, wherever we are, and to encourage folks to take time to learn about the local Indigenous peoples wherever you are, and that long connection with place and their ongoing survivance and work in your local community. So we encourage folks to seek that out and spend time thinking about the fact that we're on Indigenous land here in Oregon and elsewhere in the United States. The mission of the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped our state. That work gets done in so many different ways at the Oregon Historical Society and at other institutions as well. We're so grateful tonight to once again be able to partner with Oregon State University Press. OSU Press for many years now has been bringing out books that help us all better engage with and understand and think about Oregon history from so many different perspectives. And we are grateful for the work that they've done. So thank you to OSU Press. And thank you, of course, to all of the authors and archivists and editors and librarians and fact checkers and proofreaders and everyone else whose work goes into the making of a book. We are grateful for all that you do. The way tonight's program is going to go is we'll have each of our four authors will speak for about 10 minutes. We've given them the very difficult task of speaking very briefly about their books. So they'll each speak. I'll introduce them each in turn, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. If you're watching on Facebook, feel free to put your question right there into the comment section. If you're watching through Zoom, you can engage with us through the chat or the Q&A, and then we'll bring your question to our authors, our speakers, when they're finished presenting. So our first presenter this evening is Chris Foss. Chris is an adjunct faculty member in the History Department at Washington State University, Vancouver. He will be teaching Pacific Northwest history this spring, and he has recently taught courses on the U.S. Survey, civil rights, immigration, and the Cold War. Chris earned his PhD in U.S. Foreign Relations from the University of Colorado Boulder, and has since then also taught at the University of Portland and Willamette University. And he is also an author published in the Oregon Historical Quarterly, perhaps most importantly, so we can't forget that. So what we'll do is have all of our other authors make sure to turn off your camera now, and I'll do the same thing, and we'll turn it over to Chris Foss. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Eliza, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight. I'm really glad that you're all able to join us virtually. I am going to share my little PowerPoint here. Everybody can see that. Add a little bit more to this and go into, oh shoot, just 1 second. There we go. All right, so I'm gonna talk a little bit tonight, first about kind of the genesis of the book, where it came from, because I think that's something interesting that usually a lot of authors don't get to talk very much about in the book itself. But then I do want to share what some of the what I feel like some of the most important points are here in just the kind of short time that we have here. So this book started for me in the summer of 2012. I was in graduate school, struggling to figure out a dissertation topic, heading into my final year of coursework. And I read this article on the intersection of US domestic politics and US foreign policy. And I thought, wait a second, that kind of clicked a light bulb to me because I had been born and raised in Portland, steeped in Pacific Northwest history, worked in the Pacific Northwest history section at Powell's Books. And here's an opportunity for me to kind of combine these two interests of mine after kind of having flailed around trying to find a dissertation topic. So I wrote a research paper that fall where I talked about Richard Neuberger, the senator, Wayne Morse also, and Mark Hatfield. Those latter two figures many people know more about than Neuberger. Then I changed it around, put in Senator Frank Church of Idaho and Mike Mansfield of Montana, and I thought, well, let me make this a more regional project. But then my advisor said, maybe wisely, that's maybe too many books. And why don't we focus in on Washington, Oregon, and hone in on the effects of defense spending and international trade on these two states. And so got my topic approved. And from there, we were only off to just 3 mere years of research and another nearly 4 years of work after the dissertation was finished before getting published through OSU Press. So here it is. And so let me talk a little bit about why then I think this is significant. And I think that the work is significant because it reminds us of the importance of federal level politics in our lives. The Trump years, for many of us, whether you like him or you don't, have given us the sense that the federal is very important. What happens at the top affects people at the bottom. But when I started this project, I got the sense from friends and family even that there was a sense that politics just didn't really matter in their everyday lives, that the work of politicians was the work of these bureaucrats that were disconnected from the people, and that they didn't really represent kind of the reality of their lives. But I wanted to make an argument to counter that argument, to say that really wasn't true, and to use this region to do so. You may all remember kind of the famous quote from Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill of Massachusetts, where he says that all politics is local. And I would like to think that if he were alive today, he would say that all politics is global, G-O-L-C-A-L. And to me, that was what I found in my research, that global politics had dramatic local impacts that trickled down all the way to the level of ordinary Oregonians and Washingtonians. And so I focused on the Cold War, 1945 onward, basically, and I said that this was the period of time in which, through these politicians I'm going to talk about here, briefly introduce to you, these powerful politicians using their power, committee chairmanships, and so on and so forth, relationships that they developed locally and federally, that through them, the Pacific Northwest went from backwater of the United States to one of the leading regions of the United States, and emerged not just on the national stage, but on the world stage. And you can see in this slide kind of some of the examples of those world relationships. We've got Scoop Jackson of Washington with Deng Xiaoping. We've got Vikitia in the middle with Emperor Akihito. We've these really, and we've got Wayne Morse on Air Force One with Lyndon Johnson. Power players dealing in powerful ways and getting things done. Also, I should mention in a bipartisan manner too, if I don't bring that up later. This is an era in which party lines are not as hard as they are today. Democrats and Republicans often work together, in large part because there were liberal and conservative wings in each party, and party politics, while partisanship was still a big part of things at campaign time, is a little bit more fluid. And I think that enabled these folks, these men and women, to get things done when they might not otherwise have done so. All right, moving on. The salient example I want to just talk about here for a couple of minutes is Mark Hatfield. most salient to us, of course, I think. And his work to build up Oregon Health and Science University, you can see it on the PowerPoint, all of the money he gets for OHSU during the 80s and 90s. This was a time in which OHSU was expanding and trying to become a research university and to be kind of on a level with other big research universities. So Hatfield is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which doles out the money from the Senate, working along with the House. So he works with the Democratic leaders in the House, Tip O'Neill and Washington's Tom Foley, to get all this money for OHSU, for the VA, for the Ballum Institute, for what eventually became the Marco Hatfield Research Center. And a lot of this is cutting deals and being friendly and ingratiating. And it's work that really benefits all Oregonians. OHSU, and there's excellent work out on this by the journalist William Graves and others, showing that OHSU was really in a lot of trouble in the early 80s. But Hatfield money in part helps to get the situation turned around. And so much of this had to do with Hatfield's knowledge of what was going on abroad. He was aware, thanks to his advisors and his personal interest, of diseases like Ebola. For example, he mentioned this in a Senate floor speech in 1995 that threatened the United States in the post-Cold War era. And he very pungently made this point in a famous speech in which he says, when the Russians are coming, you're all ready to throw money at the wall. But I'm here to tell you the viruses are coming. And so Hatfield's pleas that year were thankfully heard and answered. And that was a speech in which he was trying to get not only funding for OHSU, but the National Institutes of Health. And this advocacy, I think, is really hopefully going to pay dividends for us as we try to get through the COVID-19 crisis. The book's not only about Hatfield. Other major figures from Oregon include Congresswoman Edith Green from this district, the Portland district. We've got Wayne Morse is in there a lot. Bob Packwood's in there a lot. Vic Attia, as Eliza mentioned, he's got his own chapter. I had a lot of fun working on this book. You would think that it would just be kind of a local project, but really I had to go all over the United States. A big reason why is that it's hard to get primary resources on Hatfield because his papers are currently unavailable. So I actually went to the LBJ library to get Hatfield sources. I went to Gerald Ford's library. I got an award from the Ford Foundation to do that. Went to Washington State University, University of Oregon, whole host of other regional archives to get really, for me, what was a once in a lifetime opportunity, I think, to get at the sources that are really necessary to tell the story of how the marriage of the domestic politics and US foreign policy played a crucial factor in building the careers of our most famous local politicians. So finally, in closing, I want to note that first, a couple of things to note in closing. One is that this is not to say that this kind of top-down political approach is the best approach to writing Northwest history. We are going to see a lot of different examples, obviously, tonight of how to do that. But what I think it, again, really helps us to demonstrate that the book really helps us demonstrate that politics at a high level really does matter, even if it's in kind of a trickle down sort of manner. And the final thing I just want to say is that the book is rather critical of the state of the current Northwest delegation. Maybe not necessarily in and of themselves, but because of the state of Washington, D.C. itself has changed a lot. And I just kind of, my concluding thought here before I go is to say that I feel like Northwest politicians are at their most effective when they engage with the world and when their actions help all of the people of the region and not just a few. And just finally, I just really like this picture I got for the book. This is City Hall at a sculpture of City Hall in Sapporo, which is Portland's sister city in Japan. And I think it's just a lovely representation of the beneficial outcomes of world engagement for Oregonians. So that's it for me. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. We appreciate that. And that photo is amazing. Our next speaker is Kenny Helphand. Kenny is the Philip H. Knight Professor of Landscape Architects Emeritus at the University of Oregon. He is the author of several award-winning books, including Defiant Gardens, Making Gardens in Wartime. So you're up, Kenny. Thanks very much.
Good. All right. I wanted to thank both the Historical Society and OSU Press for organizing this occasion, and everyone else who was in there watching. I was going to suggest that everyone have a beer while watching this. Folks, this book is not about beer. It's about hops that flavor beer. There are plenty of books about beer. This is about hops. I moved to Oregon almost 50 years ago to teach landscape architecture at the U of O. And that's when I first encountered hops. Unlike any other agricultural landscape I'd witnessed, I wanted to know more about this landscape and how it came to be, and I began to investigate. So my research took me up I-5 to the Hops Archive at OSU, where I met T. Edmondson Morton, who's the extraordinary archivist of the Oregon Hops Archive, and their extraordinary collection of photographs. And that was the genesis of the book, which is a collection of historical photographs, excuse me, beginning in the 1880s, of what I've named the Oregon Hopscape. Went too fast. The Oregon Hopscape, the physical environment, and the broader culture of hops. What I discovered in the research was the hops environment and the rich relationship of people to that landscape. Each photo in the book has an accompanying caption, many of which are drawn from oral histories that I'll be quoting from. I'll be showing photographs of the book that I talk, but I won't explain them all individually. I'll show many, since that is in fact the heart of the book. The Sunday Oregonian in 1911 said the following: "Hop picking time is the gayest, most carefree time, most easy money time of all the year." Poets and story writers from time immemorial lauded the beauty of the hop fields and flung about them aromatic interest. They deserve all the superlative in the market, for the crop is one of the most beautiful grown. The long vines are festooned from post to post and crowns with clusters of bell-like blossoms, marvelously delicate as to its shading and wafting as gentle fragrance, grateful to the olfactory sense. The running vines completely embower the slackened wire from which hang pendant myriads of tips and tendrils that wave and beckon in the breeze, that sweep across the mountaintops. They appear to be the millions of welcoming hands bidding one to come and join the fun. The book begins with the plant, the hops plant, and it's spread through Western Oregon. And then the book traces all the stages of hops production, from the creation of a hop yard or field as they're known, to stringing, picking, baling, and then the drying of hops. This photograph shows most of those stages, shows a hop yard there, the lines of hops, the poles supporting the hop plant, pickers in the field, the bales that are now being brought to the dryer. The construction of a hop yard is first. The hundreds of poles arrayed as a grid in the landscape, in incredible geometry on the ground. The book goes on to discuss the history of hop growing going back 5 centuries and tracing its migration from Europe to the United States and across the country to the Pacific Northwest, until in the early decades of the 20th century, the Willamette Valley became the hops capital of the world. Once poles are placed, wires are strung across poles, and then string is dropped to support the plant, and binds, as they're called, that grow up to 20 feet in a season. Beth Runmo's father was a manager at the Livesley Hop Yard located outside of Salem. Livesley actually would ultimately become mayor of Salem, have a grand house in Portland, that ultimately became the governor's mansion. She wrote, "I worked on the hop ranch from the time I was able to go outside and work at all. When school was out, we started with the training of the hops from the time they came up on the ground. You have to train them with strings and take them to the wire. Then my brother and I, when we were quite young, rode the sleds. Have you seen a hop sled? They're drawn by horses, 1 horse per sled. They're probably 6 feet high. We climbed on a ladder on the back. Then they went down between 2 rows and you would train the hops." After string is strung, this extraordinary color photograph you see there, picking begins. Before mechanical picking was introduced, picking was an incredibly labor-intensive enterprise that took the 3 to 4 weeks in the fall and literally needed tens of thousands of pickers. They came from all the surrounding areas, as well as by trains, trains and boats from Portland. They live in temporary camps provided by growers. This one was located just outside of Eugene. And the photos that we'll see congregations of people, groups posing together, much like graduation pictures. They're in groups and pairs and families and representing all walks of life. Many of these photographs are environmental portraits, people in the setting of their activity, often accompanied by the tools of their trade. The landscape background in the picture becomes a subject equal to the individuals in the foreground. In a sense, the hop yard functions like a photographer's studio. In an era when painted backdrops were often used for formal portraits in a photographer's studio, the background in these historic photographs is always out of doors with the poles and plants with the hop yard as the background. If you look closely in many of these pictures, you'll see folks wrapping themselves in strands of hops. This is in the Oregonian in 1907. Hop fields represent one striking contrast to the city. There are no social barriers. Equality is maintained under the leveling action of the Wayman scale. Preacher and bootblack, tradesman and farmer, factory hand and college boy picked side by side. The type ones meet represent every shade of mankind. Here's a school teacher with a college degree who's seeking help. Across from him is a town tramp earning money to buy beer. Here's the pretty daughter of a well-to-do farmer. The hops in her basket to pay for a pale pink party dress. A tired, nervous little woman is in the opposite row with all the energy of her body in her work. She's raising a mortgage. There are boys whose earning put them through college and others who are raising money to go to the devil. These photographs all have a celebratory aspect as a permanent record of participation in the season's harvest. This is Bessie Mercy of Corvallis, who began picking when she was 12. Pickers actually began at age 6. I picked hops with my mother and younger brother. We got up fairly early in the morning in order to have time to help with so-called chores on the farm. Prepare to eat breakfast, pack a lunch to the hop yard. My father fed and harnessed and hitched up the horse and buggy, all ready to go the approximately 4-mile journey to the hop yard. He stayed home and ran the farm as usual. Or listen to Mary Jane North from Independence, who began picking when she was 16. This is, I think, one of my favorite pictures. I love the multi-generational quality of this group. Young and old, there's boys you see in the foreground playing with the string from the hop yard, and that Walt Whitman-like look-alike older man sitting in his chair. Mary North wrote the following: I was raised in a large family, so everyone helped out. We'd get up around 5 a.m. and then the younger children would dress and get ready for a day in the field. Have breakfast, pack a large lunch. We loaded into the old car by 6 and went on our way to the field. We made our work quite competitive to keep it interesting. We generally take a 15-minute break, then a lunch break, and end around 4, depending on how bad the crop needed harvesting. When we got home, there were baths to be taken, dinner to be cooked, many chores and cleaning to be done. We'd go to bed very tired, but also thinking of another tiring and competitive field day ahead. We as young people made many friends from far and wide and looked forward to seeing them each. There were postcards printed of hops. There's an indication of the significance of that to the stage image. So who picked? There were Indians from nearby reservations who came in their regalia, and all the state's ethnic groups, largely recent immigrants to the valley, were all represented. There were Swedes, there were Armenians, there were Germans. The great, as you see some of them here, the great photographer Dorothea Lange, working for the Farm Security Administration, documented pickers on a trip through the valley in 1939. During World War II, there were bracero laborers from Mexico. There were nuns from Mount Angel that picked. There were members of the Women's Land Army, as well as soldiers from Camp Adair. And there were co-eds, the word used at the time, from OSU. We in fact learned the names of all these women from a sorority photo book in the OSU yearbook. These are the first pictures I found of women wearing pants. The work was hard and long, but there was also social gatherings and entertainment in the camps. There were movies and frequent dances. So the hops are picked, baled, then brought to the drying kilns before they're sent to breweries literally around the world to add flavor to beer. Al Hansen, whose family opened a hop yard in the 1920s, said the following: a Czech boss and his 2 helpers would weigh the hops after putting them in sacks and punch the tickets. A sack buck, the guy who was carrying these, would throw the full sacks in the wagon. A field boss was in charge of seeing that it was all done in teams, and the drivers would haul the sack hops to the dryer. At the dryer, 3 men would unload the wagons by the kilns that were done by dumping the hops on an elevated floor 20 feet from the ground, burlap covered to blow the heat to get to the hops. A fireman would start the burning in the furnace below. After drying the hops for 14 to 18 hours, they would be dry and ready to shove off to the cooling room and then baled into 200-pound bales. Pickers received from 18 cents to 100 pounds to $1.50, depending on the year. Kids got between 7 and 18 cents a pound. Every 4 pounds of green hops dried to 1 pound, so no one made much money. After the harvest in the 1930s, there was a grand festival that in the city of town of Independence that was recently revived. Note the poster over that man's shoulder, again here in a photo by Dorothea Lange. So now if you want a beer, you might think of that landscape that in fact helps flavor that beer. And I do want to thank the Oregon Hops Growers Association, whose generosity made the publication of this book possible. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kenny. I love the combination of the photographs and the quotes there. That's a wonderful taste of your book. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think then if you end your screen share, yes, then Donna will be able to come on. Our next speaker is Donna Sinclair, who is an adjunct history professor, public historian, and museum professional who specializes in oral history, Clark County, Washington community history, and politics. She lives in Washougal, Washington, where she serves on the school board. Her dissertation, Caring for the Land, Serving People, Creating a Multicultural Forest Service in the Civil Rights Era, led to her collaboration on the book that we're going to talk about tonight that she co-wrote with Gloria Brown, and the book is Black Woman in Green. So take it away, Donna.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to OHS for hosting this tonight, and thanks to OSU for publishing our book, for giving us the opportunity to do this. So I'm pulling up my screen here, and I'm going to get started. Unfortunately, Gloria cannot be with us tonight, but I want to thank Gloria most of all for giving me the opportunity to work with her. I met Gloria Brown through her voice first in 2004 as I listened to a recorded interview by one of my students. At the time, Gloria was in charge of the Siuslaw National Forest, and she was the first Black woman in the country's history to be at that level in the U.S. Forest Service. I recall that I cried as I heard her speak calmly about how she got to the Siuslaw in the first place. Gloria was a city girl from Washington, D.C., who had planned to become a television journalist. But at age 30, she became a widow with 3 children and an uncertain future instead. Gloria didn't meet me until 2013, when a friend of mine put the 2 of us together as I worked on my dissertation. 2 interviews and several discussions later, Gloria had identified me as the right person to help write her story. I was thrilled, and I immediately said yes. Neither of us knew at that time that it would take until 2020 to see it completed. So the outcome is a book that was born of a combination of those first interviews, hours of conversation and additional recorded material as we traveled together, and the written word that was revised collaboratively and read aloud, often over FaceTime. Gloria lives in Lake Oswego, I live in Washougal, and we both faced a lot of challenges in the 5 years that we worked on the book. Some of those challenges are included in the book. So tonight I'm going to tell you a few stories and read a few excerpts in the hope that you'll feel the richness of Gloria's story too. So this is what the agency looked like well into the 1980s. Gloria went to work for the US Forest Service in 1974 as a dictation machine transcriber in the Washington, DC office. When she started her career with the Forest Service, only 20% of the workforce was female, and very few African Americans or women were in professional positions. Even today, only 4% of the agency is African American, and only half of them are female. This is a picture of Gloria when she graduated from the University of Maryland with a journalism degree, and it wasn't long after her husband was killed by a drunk driver as they left the college campus. She was a receptionist in the Forest Service, and she lost not only her husband, but his income. She had to take her 3 children out of private Catholic school and move to a crummy apartment in a poor neighborhood in Maryland. And that was her motivation for deciding that she needed to move up in the agency. She said to me once, "I had to feed those kids." So Gloria decided that she needed a mentor. And with some guidance, she also realized that if she wanted to be in management, she would have to leave DC. She thought she would end up in Atlanta, but that was not to be. So here she is in the Pacific Northwest, and Gloria explains it in the book. She says, "I needed to understand how a region works in the field. So Tom and John facilitated a 2-week detail to the information office in Region 6 in Oregon, on the other side of the country. This was my first plane ride ever, and it exposed me to an entirely new world. As the plane circled to land at the Portland International Airport, I was struck by the brilliant white-topped peaks of Mount Hood. I had seen the Smoky Mountains, but never anything like this. I also quickly realized that Oregon's population was as white as the mountain's peaks. I had worked with Caucasians for a long time, but never before had I seen a place with no African Americans. Yes, I learned there were a few in the state, about 37,000 in a population of 2.5 million, but they weren't very visible in the Portland Regional Office, the city's downtown area, and especially not on the Forest Service districts I visited. The most diversity I saw in Portland was in the personnel office, the mailroom, and the civil rights office. When I visited the Willamette National Forest, I saw no people of color. There were women, but at the forest and district levels, no one looked like me. What I did see everywhere I looked was Northwest green, the color of money in the Forest Service and the hue of deliverance for me." So she would have a lot more field experiences and ultimately got a transfer as a public affairs specialist to the regional office in Missoula, Montana, a state with less than 1% Black population. So Gloria learned a lot in those years. And I'm going to read another section here. So she says, "I found myself surrounded by people who had worked half their lives in the woods, who shared stories about hunting and fishing, activities I had never done. The talk around the fire educated me. I had all the questions. Where did these huckleberries come from? Do we have to worry about bears or mountain lions? What about snakes? I found out there were black bears, but no dangerous snakes. I also learned to identify scat. I had never seen a cow patty, much less grizzly poop. The former is round, crusted over, and flat. The latter resembles dog poo, but bigger. I learned that huckleberries grow abundantly among the redwoods and Douglas fir. Native people had been picking the berries each summer for thousands of years. Non-natives had turned harvesting into an enterprise that included wine, candy, and jellies. Now the little purple berry was at the heart of one of the many multiple-use conflicts on national forest lands. She also learned to ride a horse. I'd never ridden a horse before, had never even touched a pony, yet here I was learning to mount, ride, and steer a live animal. At first, I was too excited to be afraid. As we clomped down narrow trails over canyons, our guide told me not to worry. Then I realized that if my horse fell over, I would surely die. I'd never thought about dying at work before, but as I looked down from the back of a 5-foot-high animal into a ravine 10 feet below a trail already hundreds of feet high, it suddenly felt possible. I stopped looking down. This was one experience of many that made me say to myself, I can do this. So here's Gloria, and she learned that she needed to get a forestry credentials in order to be promoted. So she applied for a job on the Willamette National Forest and made a deal with the forest supervisor that if she could get his forest plan published, and it was long past due, he would give her a sabbatical to attend Oregon State University's School of Forestry, an experience that's described in the chapter, Awakening the Forester Within. Gloria hated dendrology, and she's actually very funny about this too, but she made it through OSU with good grades and a plan. She returned to the Willamette and moved from an administrative professional to a management 460 forester, a shift that we compared from moving from a non-commissioned officer to a commissioned officer in the military. She was on her way to becoming a district ranger. But after being told that a temporary position would not be made permanent, she decided to take another avenue. And this one is one that I found that was common for African-American employees seeking to advance in the agency. She left the Forest Service and went to work for the Bureau of Land Management instead. She became district director of the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center. This is a picture of Gloria and her son Andre doing living history at the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center. And Gloria put her natural resource chops and people skills to work in Baker City. There she earned awards from the Cattlemen's and Miners Associations. And when her mother became ill, she was able to obtain a transfer back to Washington, D.C. and was put in charge of the BLM's Eastern States Land and Realty Program. So it didn't take her long, though, to discover that she now hated the city. The interim years had turned her into a Westerner. So she made a call and she went back to the Forest Service, this time as the first Black woman to manage the Mount St. Helens National Monument on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. She was thrilled to return to the Northwest, where her daughters and son had settled, and she reconnected with her life partner, Phil Weichland. So here she is with the chief of the Forest Service at the time, Mike Dombeck. 2 years later, Gloria became the forest supervisor on the Siuslaw National Forest. And so I'm going to read you another excerpt. I was heading back to Corvallis, only this time I had truly arrived. I was the first female African-American forest supervisor in the nation. I was proud of my tenure at Mount St. Helens, and this new appointment felt like the reward for a job well done. The Eugene Register-Guard, Corvallis Gazette-Times, and the Oregonian newspapers introduced me to my new constituency as a pioneer blazing a trail from Washington, D.C. through Montana, Washington State, and Oregon. My position as forest supervisor was new territory, not only for me, but also for the Forest Service. We were betting on each other and the stakes were high. From there, Gloria went on to become the forest supervisor of the Los Padres National Forest in California, which was a very different landscape beset by fire. By then, her years of experience had given her a confidence that I think really comes through in the book's penultimate chapter, Can You See Me Now? Gloria had achieved her goals, but illness and lack of support from the Forest Service forced her into an early retirement. I met her in person not long after this. So this is Gloria and I, and we're at OHS on March 8th, right after the book came out and right before the shutdown. The first time that Gloria told coworkers that she wanted to be in charge of a national forest, they laughed. But Gloria not only figured out how to do it, she made it happen through a combination of personality, smarts, and force of will. Near the end of the book, she recalled that becoming a forest supervisor, as she put it, would be a test of her survival as a leader and of the Siuslaw National Forest and its employees. It was also a test for women of color, and it was a test she passed with high marks. So I knew that Gloria had an important story, but I didn't know then that telling it would pull together so many threads of history, from the African-American migration story out of the South after World War II, to civil rights history, to an important tale of a Black woman and a single parent, a woman whose determination and resilience was couched within a broader environmental, social, and institutional history of an agency, a region, and a nation. And I'm only sorry that Gloria can't be with us here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. And thanks for including that photo. That was a great event. And I think I see a little bottle of hand sanitizer next to your chair then. We were so innocent then.
We managed to eat right after that too.
So our final speaker tonight is Roger Hull. So excellent. Roger, we'll ask you to turn your camera and microphone on while I'm introducing you. Roger is an independent arts writer and curator, and a professor of art history emeritus at Willamette University. He has written monographs and organized retrospective exhibitions on a dozen Oregon artists, most recently Lucinda Parker and John Stahl. So take it away, Roger.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed these presentations immensely, though I feel like I need a beer pretty soon. Okay, is that on?
Yes, it is. We can see your slide. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. So my offering this evening is a monograph on Clifford Gleason. Actually, it's Clifford Gleason who is the subject of the most recent of these artist monographs that I've written over the years. This was published in 2020 in conjunction with an exhibition of the same title at the Hallie-Ford Museum of Art at Willamette University in Salem. I consider these books not to be catalogs of the exhibitions, but freestanding monographs that, in this case, trace the history of Clifford Gleason's life, traces the development of his art over time. The time span in play here is 1938 to 1978, 40-year period, placing his production in the context of Oregon art generally, American art more broadly, and tying him into the cultural life of our area. So let us begin. Here is Clifford Gleason when he was 13, posing for a photograph in the local Salem newspaper. Clifford Gleason was born Carl, almost forgot how he was born Carl Goss in Portland, but in his infancy he was adopted by a couple in Salem, Leon and Wilhelmina Gleason, owners of the Gleason Glove Factory in Salem. And they raised Clifford, they renamed him Clifford Gleason, and raised him as an adored only child growing up in Salem. He attended, well, his aunt told him that the first glimmers of his artistic talent came when he was a very young child in Salem, scribbling drawings on the walls of his parents' factory. In school in Salem, he had the advantage of two excellent art teachers, one in junior high and one in high school. The high school art teacher was named Ruth Broughty, and she was very familiar with and very excited about modern art of the era, Picasso, Matisse, the Cubists, the German Expressionists, and so forth. Sort of astonishing awareness of modernism, according to Clifford. And she recognized in him a real emerging talent as an artist. And he, as he later said, she really was the impetus for his becoming an artist. She really is the one who gave him confidence to be something special. He considered himself quite inept in many areas. He did not graduate from high school because although he excelled in art, he did not do well in other courses. He really was prone to thinking of himself as something of a failure, but not in art. And that's where this title, The Promise of Paint, comes in. He found in painting and in art generally a real refuge, an area where he knew he could excel and did. So there he is at 13. Here he is at age 25 in 1938. Now, in 1938, during the Depression, the WPA era gave rise to the federal art centers in various moderately scaled cities around the country, and Salem had a particularly successful version of the Federal Art Center at age 25, and it opened in 1938 in this old Salem High School, downtown Salem. Clifford had graduated from high school, was an active practicing artist, but he enrolled in the advanced painting class at the Federal Art Center, the instructor of which was Louis Bunce. Louis Bunce, as you may know, was a very noted modern Oregon painter and printmaker who was only 6 years older than Gleason, but by the time he came to the Federal Art Center, he had been in New York for some years. He had studied at the Art Students League. He had befriended Jackson Pollock, his fellow student at the Art Students League. He was on hand when the Museum of Modern Art opened in 1929. And so he was quite the guy to be back in Salem at the Federal Art Center. And Gleason thought very, very highly of him, and Bunce thought highly of Gleason in turn. This work that we see in the background here is this one, Alice in Wonderland. And this really stands as Gleason's first major known work. And my narrative in the book starts, about his art anyway, starts with this piece. This was done in the advanced painting class. The students in that class conferred with the children at Bush Elementary School in Salem, asking them what subjects they would like depicted in 2 different murals being planned for the library at Bush School. And the students came up with a couple of ideas, and one was Alice in Wonderland. Then the students in Louis' class set about designing potential versions of these stories, and the one that was chosen was Clifford's. So here we have this kind of astonishingly avant-garde mural. I don't know if you would ever find a more astonishingly avant-garde mural under WPA auspices. If you look nationwide, it's quite astonishing. And a very sort of surrealistic, almost hallucinogenic. It kind of gets at underlying qualities of the story itself, it seems to me. It really is a kind of a marvel. Bush School was torn down in 2005, but this painting and the other one designed by another student were saved and moved to North Salem High School, where they can be seen today. They were conserved and are in very good condition. So we're lucky to have that. Also from this WPA Federal Art Center period is this still life with Spools by Gleason. He did a lot of easel paintings. In fact, mostly that's what he did, murals. That mural was an unusual piece. Still Life with Spools was probably in his 1939 solo exhibition at the Federal Art Center. It was his first solo exhibition of many, many, many that he was to have in years to come. Again, this was presumably done in conjunction with Louis Bunce's advanced painting class. Whatever it is, or however it came to be, it's an amazingly sophisticated painting for a young man of 26, high school graduate, but without much more training than that, in Salem in the 30s. It's very much inflected by European modernism. It reminds us of Georges Braque, the French cubist. Braque's love of frames within frames, still lives on tilted tables, recognizable objects but abstracted to a degree. Really very suave, sophisticated painting for the time and for the location. The Spools, I argue in the monograph, have a kind of local industrial link to the Gleason factory, the glove-making factory, which presumably involved spools of thread and also buttons, which are scattered around on the table. So one might argue that European modernism and local industry merge here in a kind of intriguing way. 10 years later, we find Gleason painting like this, still very modernistic and to an extent, although it's modernism that recalls earlier phases of it in Europe, Fauvism and other earlier phases. It's not exactly cutting edge American modern painting for this moment, but just wait, he will make the shift momentarily. In the mid-30s, the Gleasons lost their glove factory in the Depression, and Leon Gleason, the father, became the superintendent of Belcrest Memorial Park, which is a cemetery in the south part of Salem. And the family, including Gleason, lived there. Gleason lived with his parents well into his adult life. And he did a series of paintings inspired, broadly speaking, by the Belcrest area. And this is one of them, a kind of combination still life and architecture scape, you might say. So a beautiful little painting, and it is quite small, but somewhat referencing earlier modernism than 1947 might suggest. But just wait, by the late 50s, early 60s, he goes through an experimental period of creating works like this, which are obviously extremely different from Alice in Wonderland or Still Life with Spools or Belcrest scenes or whatever. And this is an example of his crinkled paper works, where he would take rice paper, just take a little sip of water there, crinkle it. He would take rice paper and dampen it and then crinkle it. So he had this very irregular surface. And then he would apply onto that surface little patches of gouache, sort of watercolor paint, gouache, and in this case, some collage as well. And the result would be these highly abstract, very different from the still lifes and fairy tale paintings and so forth that he had done earlier. And I argue rather strenuously in the book, these immediately precede and establish the basis for his oil paintings, his larger oil paintings on canvas, not crinkled paper anymore, but oil on canvas that he did in the early part of the 60s. So here is Strange Garden, a marvelously textured work, the texture playing off, I think, the crinkled paper pieces of just earlier, but now done with the oil pigment, very richly applied, lots of overlaying of one color on top of another, lots of see-through to underlying layers of color, tremendous paintwork, building up these ridges of color, letting accents of bright color show through that red, that salmon pink, the blue, against these other kind of darker shades. It's in works like this that I think the promise of paint really comes home to benefit Gleason. He loved to work with paint. He worked with it very thickly and richly in this period especially. And you can see the kind of arrival at American modernism as it was being defined in the late 50s and early 60s in this country. In the middle 60s, he came across the art of a German artist by the name of Julius Bissier. He knew of Bissier, he found out about him through a catalog for an exhibition at the Seattle World's Fair of 1962. And Bissier is known for compositions that are somewhat akin to this one by Gleason, where individual forms and shapes are kind of floated on a broader ground, often anchored to very thin lineaments of line as these forms are. And we've moved away in Gleason's work here from the thick all over paintwork to more locally applied versions of it, as in that upper pod there with the rich red and so forth. When these paintings are seen in the real, they are really astonishingly rich in their textured passages. Gleason said that when he saw Bissier's work, he felt that he was looking at paintings where a breeze of fresh air was blowing through them. And you can see, I think, that compared to that kind of crusted, enclosed, Strange Garden painting we just saw, that things do open up and float free in this piece. And that led on to his later works. We're now in the getting into 1970. The zero is cut off by me on the screen there. But here is a marvelously beautiful painting with a very elaborate title, Black Vase with Lilacs on a Violet Table. There is a sense of humor to Gleason's work, and I think a title like that for a painting like this sort of gets at that. But in the 70s, he begins to move his forms out toward the corners, toward the edges of the composition, leaving whole areas not blank exactly, they're richly painted, but very neutral, so that your attention is brought to particular parts of the painting. And that tendency to move out to edges and sort of link up with the edges becomes even more definite in the early 70s. 1972, 1973, he was the recipient of an Art Advocates grant. The Art Advocates was a patron group in Portland. I should say that Salem was his headquarters through the middle 60s. And then, although he kept in touch with Salem, he relocated to Portland and lived the latter years of his life, mostly in Portland. And in 72, 73, got this Art Advocates grant, which allowed him to work completely on art making for a full year with all his materials supplied and everything that he needed at hand. And he really was productive. Bigger paintings than before, very open, bright, colorful paintings, such as Children's Garden or Green Butterfly, another of the Art Advocates Project paintings. So by now, you see, we really are pushing out to the edges, but not quite going over them, except for this one little green thing. Do you see that green spot up on the upper edge of the left side? I think we're going to have to take that as our green butterfly, the one form that is liable to escape from this work, but then that's butterflies for you. And then finally, here is a photo of Clifford at his easel in one of his Salem studios. He had various ones in Salem and then various ones in Portland. He is smoking. Gleason was quite the smoker, quite the drinker, in fact, notoriously alcoholic, and led a kind of difficult life. But as I say, once he got into painting, he was going strong. Let me read a quote from him and then conclude with it. He said this about painting as work. Painting is hard work, he said. It's work. Sure, it's work. When you're using all your faculties for one thing, standing in front of an easel, you don't realize it because it is inspiring, but you are exhausted at the end of the day. You're bound to be because you are using everything. Painting is hard work. That quote, which I kind of love about work, let's do the work, comes from an oral history interview from 1978 that he did with Charles D. Gregorio of the Oregon Historical Society. And that transcript and also the tape of the oral history is on file at the Oregon Historical Society. And it's wonderful that that record of their conversation has been preserved. And so Clifford Gleason, thank you very much for your attention, and over now.
Thank you so much, Roger. What a wonderful quote. And thanks for the shout out to the oral history collection at the Oregon Historical Society.
You bet.
And all of our speakers, if you want to go ahead and turn your cameras back on, and to our attendees, now's your opportunity. If you have questions or comments for our speakers, please go ahead and put those in the chat or the Q&A. You can use the comment section on Facebook if you've got questions. Want to make sure folks who've been attending know that there are links in the chat, so you can open that up and click on those links to learn more about some of the subjects, and also so that you can purchase copies of the book from the OHS Museum store, which we appreciate very much. And of course, all of you who are OHS members will get your member discount on the store purchase as well. So we'll just see, that was an amazing transformation of art from style to style. It felt like, how beautiful to see that. So,
yeah, he really did evolve in that 40 years.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, this has just been such a wonderful array of knowledge and perspective about Oregon history. It's just fabulous to hear. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, which I think means that folks are inspired by your brief talks and clicking on the links and going to buy the books.
Sure, that's it.
Well, I'll just give a last call. I'll see if any of you want to comment on each other's talks at all. You're welcome to. Otherwise, we'll let folks log off and carry on at home. All right. Yes, Donna.
I always have something to say, but I just want to say I really appreciated watching that transformation in the painting. And I loved hearing about Charles DiGregorio's interview of Clifford Gleason. So as a former oral historian at the Oregon Historical Society, I feel like I knew Charles DiGregorio, even though I didn't. So, so that was really lovely. And his work was really fascinating. And to the other two authors, I also really enjoyed seeing those pictures of the hops and just the various scenarios that you presented, Kenny. That was great. And Christopher, I think your book is going to be really interesting and useful as someone who teaches Pacific Northwest history. So that's really all I have to say. But I was actually inspired. I wrote down here that I need to tell my my brother-in-law and sister-in-law that they should buy Roger's book for their daughter who does abstract art, because I think she would absolutely love it. So it was inspiring.
I think I'm going to be thinking about the word glocalist.
Yes.
That is such a great one. That connection between local and global is just really fascinating. And, you know, thinking about, of course, the way now I'm thinking about hops being packed up and going all over the world. So the ways that Oregon's global. So.
I wanted to add something.
Yeah, Kenny.
Can you hear me? Yeah, related to Donna's, I think the person you talk about, her history is fascinating. But I was thinking of a parallel history of a guy named Ronnie Yimsa. Ronnie is a graduate of our department in landscape architecture, except Ronnie was born in Cambodia, was a survivor of the killing fields, was a refugee in Southeast Asia. Ultimately was essentially made his way to Portland, then studied landscape architecture in our department, and then worked for the Forest Service for over 30 years, and then recently retired. So I think, you know, the Forest Service has offered people some rather extraordinary opportunities and extraordinary people who've done rather amazing things. He went on, in fact, now actually works in Cambodia and has developed a school there in the town which was his grandfather's. He's developed a technical school there, and we visited him there. Rather extraordinary.
Wow.
Oh,
And-
thank you for sharing that, Kenny. That is fascinating.
He's also written 3 memoirs of his experience. Yeah.
Well, I've written that down because I worked with Gloria on this book. I didn't publish anything out of my own dissertation, which is focused on incorporating women and people of color into the Forest Service and really looking at the institutional shifts and how that happened and what it took to actually bring people who are outside of the mainstream into a white male agency.
Mhm.
So I've got to look at Ronnie's. His name actually sounds familiar. So thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Well, Donna, if there's anything from your dissertation that didn't get into the book, I know a great journal. That would be
Eliza, you know that.
always
Gloria's story. I have a very brief intro. The Gloria's story, but I have a very brief intro that has a sort of theoretical framework of my dissertation, and that's it.
That's great.
But it's all Gloria, as it should be.
We'll give her our best, please. And thanks all of you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you for all of your work. We know it is really, really difficult, tenacious work to get these books out, and we admire you for doing it. So thank you very much. Everyone click on those links, head on over to the OHS Museum store and purchase for yourself and any holiday giving. And we'll see you at the next program and hopefully in person sometime in the new year. So take care, everyone. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
You too. Take care.